on overdrive. A car that dared to ask, what if a little sedan was built to be faster than a Lamborghini? And what if that little car, underneath it all, was based on an existing high-volume production car to keep costs down? And what if it had a trick state-of-the-art all-wheel drive system and used a turbocharger? That's right, the cheap tuner hero that sparked one of automotive's greatest rivalries, and still occupies a space in all of our hearts, despite being unceremoniously killed off nearly a decade ago. The Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution. The Lancer actually began life in 1973 as a competitor for the Pinto, more or less. And I'd like to own one, but just for the history, not because it's actually worth driving. Know what I'm saying? That evolved into the A170 Lancer in 1979, which is again pretty much super unremarkable. But it did have one very important iteration, a turbocharged version built for rally. You see, unlike Subaru, who suddenly decided to take World Rally seriously in the early 90s, Mitsubishi has always been in the running. They even built a couple Group B cars. In 1988, the Lancer changed again. It switched from rear-wheel drive to front-wheel drive, which, and it stopped being their premier rally car. That honor went to the Galant VR4, a car which, under the hood, lived this little engine called the 4G63T. You might have heard of that. So, to speed things along, that brings us to 1992, when WRC competitors were switching from bigger cars like the Subaru Legacy and Ford Sierra to smaller cars like the Subaru Impreza WRX and the Ford Escort. Mitts ditched the much chonkier Galant and shoved that powerful 4G63T into their smaller, lighter Lancer, evolving it from a random lame grocery getter into the Lancer Evo. Oh, and overnight, creating possibly the greatest car rivalry ever to come out of Japan. And make no mistake, it was an absolute battle from the very beginning. Newcomer Subaru hit the ground running and secured early wins against the new Evo 1, in no small part due to having a brilliant driver. But hold on to that, since Mitsubishi would get their own call-in, named Tommy, and the tables would turn. See, that's literally how close these two cars have always been. Every time the STI looked like it was gonna dominate, the Evo would, well, evolve and get a little faster. Then Subaru would tune another 10 horsepower out of their Boxer, and the Evo would have to evolve again. The big difference, though, is that the WRX basically stayed the same until the 2000s, whereas the Evo went through 5 friggin' generations. We aren't gonna spend a lot of time on every variation. We'll just focus on the major changes, starting with the Evo 1, which made 247 horsepower and had 2 trims. The GSR, which was fancy, had power locks and anti-lock brakes, and the MR, which didn't have any of those stupid safety features. But that car would quickly evolve into the Evo 2 in 1994. It was faster, it was longer, it was wider, and it had comparatively huge brakes. It needed all that stability to contain the huge power upgrade. With some premier tuning, Mitsubishi managed to get a whole 9 more horsepower. Like I said, there are only really incremental changes between Evos. In 1995, we got the Evo 3. Evo 3! The Evo 3 almost made the 276 horsepower that all performance cars from Japan made. Weird how that works out. But even with the bigger turbo and a better intercooler, it actually lagged behind in power compared to its Subaru rival. However, this is when the Evo got the big mouth to fit the big intercooler and the bigger wing, which makes the Evo 3 one of my personal favorites. It's also the car that the truly legendary Tommy Mäkinen, ever heard of him, got his start in. But the Finnish driver was only just getting into it. Then in 1996, they built the Evo 4. The 4 was a huge upgrade. Even though it was only made for 2 years, it was branded an instant legend. Not only did it appear in Gran Turismo, but it actually won the manufacturer's championship and regularly beat out Subaru to the podium. The 4 also had new and improved 4-wheel drive with crazy active yaw control, which, for the sake of simplicity, it's a lot like what the Nissan GTR uses. Let me know down in the comments below if you want a video explaining it. To go with all those better systems, the 4 got some visual upgrades too. Mostly just a pointier nose and some bitchin' rally lights. The 5 followed in '98, but only stuck around for a single year. And basically, the 5 had a body kit from the factory, made 276 horsepower, just like the last ones, a 20 horse upgrade, and it got 17-inch wheels. Pro tip for the tuners out there looking for the one to buy. The 5 is the first with the reinforced internals. Perfect for trying to make 1,000 horsepower. 1999 gave us the Y2K scare, and also the Evo 6, which had a bigger intercooler, a better turbo, and weirdly still only made 276 horsepower. Allegedly. Most importantly, there was the 1999 Tommy Mäkinen edition, a car we called one of the greatest JDM cars of all time. Then in 2001, the Evo 7 dropped. Now hey, I told you there were a lot of these things, but the 7 represents another huge change. Subaru had really upped the game with the Bug-Eye WRX. So in response, the Lancer switched to an all-new platform with a lot of quality of life upgrades. Mostly, it had better differentials. And they finally introduced a new trim to join the GSR and MR, the GT-A. An A that stood for automatic. That's what we call foreshadowing, folks. Outside, the 7 was just pointier and a bit bigger. You can see Paul Walker drive a green one in Too Fast, Too Furious. Or is it yellow? I can't decide, you tell me. Which is insane, because back then, the Lancer Evo was never sold in the United States. But somehow, enough people knew it was such an amazing car that it would be picked to be the star of a Hollywood blockbuster. Now, we've said when talking about the WRX that Subaru just suddenly appeared with the WRX in the US. They put the Bug-Eye on a lot and people went apeshit, like a switch was flipped. The Lancer though, well, it was more like a slow burn. It was a tuner hero even before the WRX hit the scene. It was in video games and in animes and then in Fast and Furious. But we still couldn't actually buy them. The 8 is where everything changed. That happened in 2003, when the Evo finally came to America. The 8 wasn't a complete overhaul, but it looked a bit more modern, and it absolutely reignited that rivalry. Mitsubishi saw the success that was the WRX in the States, and they wanted some of that sweet tuner cred. So the 8 was meant to destroy the STI. They traded back and forth through the mid-2000s with faster and faster cars coming out. You can watch the aftermath on YouTube. There's millions of Evo vs WRX vids. Finally, in 2006, the Evo peaked with the Evo 9. It got the all-new MyVex system, which was basically Mitsubishi's VTEC. It had bits of carbon fiber, tons of aluminum, N-key wheels, and a huge overbuilt turbocharger, which in the end means that the 9 is just an 8 with some fancy bits. But I reserve that it's still the best Evo ever made. Together, the 8 and the 9 are the pinnacle of Mitsubishi. And no one who was in the car scene in the mid to late 2000s didn't know about the car. And the 4G63 moved up from iconic to downright legendary. You basically had 2 camps. The Subaru camp, hoping their ringland failures and head gasket woes would stay away, and the Mitsubishi camp, hoping their transmissions would hold out. Boxer versus inline 4. Longitudinal versus transverse, symmetrical all-wheel drive versus active yaw control, vape bros, JDM lifers. In the end, maybe for the best, the 4G63 ended its 20-year reign, and the Evolution ended its reign as the de facto sports sedan, the Lamborghini killer. The car that made people want to live the JDM life. Oh, and then I guess in 2007, there was another Lancer Evo, the Evo 10. It was a total overhaul. It was a bit heavier, a bit slower, and worst of all, finding a manual was rare. You could opt instead for the twin clutch automatic, which was actually okay, but everyone knows the manual option is the one to have. Perhaps worst of all is that they replaced that 4G63 with the 4B11, which is just not the ultra-tunable engine that we all really wanted. Okay, this is unfair. The Evo 10 is a perfectly fine car, and it's actually an absolute joy to drive. But with the 10, now it was expensive, untunable, and frankly, sorta hard to live with. Not only did it get truly terrible gas mileage, but you'd spend a lot more time working on it compared to the bulletproof 4G engines. The Evo 10 culminated with the final edition in 2015. These ones actually shipped with manual transmissions only, though a 5-speed compared to Subaru's universal 6-speed, and it had 303 horsepower. It was fine, but it just wasn't enough to save the Evolution. Going into the late 2010s, Mitsubishi was losing popularity, and it was producing some pretty mediocre cars. They had a long history with cylinder head problems, and their cheap construction, coupled with their frequent partnerships with Dodge, who had their own problems, meant that the company was often seen as the low-tier Japanese brand. The rise in crossover sales meant that Mitsubishi had to take the safe route, and safe meant bigger vehicles, not sporty experimental sedans. Today, we remember the Lancer as the giant slayer. Mitsubishi just has something that Subaru never did. Maybe it's the design language. I certainly think the Lancer looks better than the Impreza. Or maybe it's that Subaru got gigantic, and we're hardwired to root for the underdog. Whatever the reason is, I for one am happy that Mitsubishi had the cojones to make a sedan that dared to take on brands like Lamborghini. And that's how I choose to remember it. Brad can keep the STI. I'm Team Evo. Hey, thanks for watching, and maybe consider checking out this video on turbochargers versus superchargers, since turbos are the star of these small little sedans. But whatever you do, just promise me one thing.
Keep living the ideal lifestyle.